Hi everybody, my name is Lisa Haven, and I'm here to talk to you today about the relationship of Charlie Chaplin and Max Linder. I've just finished a book on Max, a biography, which is accompanied by Catherine Corman from the Film Museum in Amsterdam's filmography, which she's composed over the last 30 years, so it should be a great book. It should be out in the fall. You probably all know Max, but I'll give you a little background on him anyway before we get to 1917 when he finally meets Chaplin. So he was born Gabriel Olivier in a little town called Caverne, just outside Saint-Lubez in France, which is about 10 miles from Bordeaux. His parents were vintners, and they made a lot of money producing wine, but Max was not interested in that as a career. He was really one of the middle children, the second boy out of four. And so he finally talked his parents into sending him to boarding school and settled on a career in the arts for the most part. Of course, being that this was the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, there wasn't really any idea of going into film. Film didn't really, exist in the minds of young people in terms of a career. So he went on the stage and he got mainly small parts, very little words in the paper. And then he began to change his name, first from Max Lacerda, then to Max Linder, which he settled on finally. In 1905, he was asked or suggested to go to see Charles Pathé to see if he wanted to maybe pick up some work in the films at that point for a total of 20 francs a day, which is very little money. But he did, and he spent the first 2 years of his career pretty much doing any sort of part. By 1906-07, he started to be referred to as Max in the film's titles, and he has developed pretty much his little dapper gentleman character, which carried him through the rest of his career in one form or the other. By the time his little gentleman character came into popularity, it just began to get more and more and more popular. So by the time 1916 rolled around, a couple things had changed. First of all, the war hit France and hit Europe and decimated the film industry, so there was no going on for Max in France at that point. Second, he had volunteered for service, and even though he was simply driving a car, he had exposed himself to enough danger or health risk that some of his old ailments came back in sharp relief, I guess, and were to cause him a lot of pain the rest of his life. So, at this point in time, George Spohr got the brilliant idea to ask Max to come over and replace Charlie Chaplin as his main comedy star for the SNA studios. Chaplin had left and really had burnt the bridge with Spohr pretty much. And so George was trying to find somebody else to fit the bill because his company was already feeling the pain of losing Chaplin. It also lost Billy Anderson at about the same time, and the Niles Studios. So by the time Max came over, there was no Niles Studios with the SNA brand. There was no Billy Anderson. There was simply the Chicago studios in Chicago. And, of course, Linder had lots of problems with the cold weather, as well as Chaplin did. He managed to make 2 films in Chicago, one of which the first was Max Comes Across, which basically took his boat journey across the Atlantic as a source of film fun. And the second one is called Max Wants a Divorce, which has a very familiar farce plot. And so by the third one, he goes out to California. He gets Spohr to allow him to do that. And they have to rent a studio for him out there in Hollywood because they don't have any property out there anymore. It was at this point that he meets Charlie Chaplin for the first time, gets invited to Lone Star Studios. There's a nice little film attached to this introduction that you will watch about that. It's about 3 minutes long, of the two of them meeting supposedly for the first time, but they were to meet many times after that. Jack Spears in his book suggested that Charlie and Max lived next door to each other and would spend their evenings talking about gags and many other things. Not true, there's no evidence for that. However, not so much in this first SNA trip, but when he comes back over again in 1919, the two become pretty thick. And there's a couple of reasons for that, I think. So after Max gets more and more sick, ends up in a sanatorium out in California after he makes his third and final SNA film, Max in a Taxi, he goes back to Paris. And believe me, that was not a good time to be taking a boat anywhere, but he made it. He sits over there for a couple of years. He tries to get back to the U.S. He can't get anybody interested. He makes a film called Le Petit Café, which is really an interesting film, directed by Raymond Barnau. And then he finally decides to come back at the end of 1919, in December. And at that point, he starts his first film in January. It's going to be called 7 Years Bad Luck, which is a very good one. He filmed it in the Maurice Tourneur studio in Universal. It's the only one he could find, or the best one he could find. And then after that, he began to try to get the rights for a French farce called Coralie and Company, which ended up being Be My Wife. So basically Max turning a very bawdy French farce into something somewhat palatable to the American public, although in some sense it's so complicated that it is difficult to understand on the first go-round. You probably have to watch it twice or so. All during this time, he is trying to make himself part of the social life of Hollywood, California. He, of course, visits and goes out with Charlie on many occasions. Charlie at this time had just divorced Mildred and was hanging out with some other ladies, but was essentially a bachelor, so it was a good time. That's one of the reasons why they spent so much time together, I think, is because Max was such a bachelor, a decided bachelor, so everyone thought at this point in time. So he was the perfect one to hang out with for Charlie. They would go to premieres, such as the premiere of Foolish Wives by von Stroheim, and they also went to Rudolph Valentino's The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse together. They would sneak into previews, snuck into a preview of Be My Wife together, stood in the back and were gratified to hear the laughter, and spent a lot of time at parties. Max was famous for his Christmas parties because his birthday is on December 16th, and he could then lump the birthday into a Christmas party. So his first one in Hollywood was in 1920, and he was able to, well, he kind of pulled the wool over his guests' eyes by taking cheap bottles of red wine and putting expensive labels on them. So that was his joke the first time around. The second time around, he was suffering from Klee guys, so you can see the picture that I've provided here of that party where he's wearing sunglasses, and that's the reason. But he's got Chaplin with him, he's got a lot of other stars from the silent era, and he's got his own personal chef, Georges Jamier, who made a wonderful meal for everyone. So you can see the inside of his house. This would be his house. It was a brand new house when he bought it. It's the end of a long street, and up against one of the Hollywood Hills, and still there as far as I'm able to find out. Robert Florey talks about climbing up the numerous steps outside the house to get to the front door, and how the whole front yard was this gorgeous plant chaos that was very intoxicating. So that was the Christmas parties of 20 and 21. Max was to leave America for the last time in 1922, after he finished his third film called The Three Must Get Theirs, which was a parody not just on the Three Musketeers, but on Fairbanks's recent Three Musketeers. In fact, he was allowed to use the same sets. That's also a notable film for the fact that he used anachronisms all throughout. Telephones hanging from trees, motorcycles, typewriters, things like that. It's a great film. And it also shows you what a master swordsman Max really was, This was something he was trained in when he was in boarding school, and he kept it going the rest of his life, winning championships and teaching other actors how to do it. So at the end of all this, there was a farewell party for Max, I believe at Chaplin's house. And Doug was there, Mary was there, and several other people. And they showed Three Musketeers. They premiered it at that party. And the big three liked it so much that they decided finally to offer him a contract with United Artists, which was going to be called Allied Corp in Europe. And so this is really what Max had been waiting for, but it was too little too late at this point in time. So, his big buddies didn't come to his rescue until much too late. However, this was a farewell party for him, and he certainly appreciated their friendship. And he went home to live out the last 3 years of his life in exceedingly less interesting projects, including his marriage. But on his death, and we all know that he was part of a double suicide on Halloween night, 1925, he and his wife in a hotel room in Paris. After that point, they say that Charlie called a moment of silence for Max at the Chaplin studios where everybody stopped working. And then Kono, Chaplin's Japanese valet, said that there was a huge bouquet of rotting flowers that had been sent to Charlie by Max that stayed in the bungalow for many years after his death. So, in a nutshell, that's the relationship between Max and Charlie, except for the fact that Max was reported as saying that he especially liked Charlie Chaplin because he felt that they had a lot in common in terms of their demeanor, except Max believed that all he had to do was to try to get up in the morning, smile, and tell himself that it was going to be a wonderful day. And yet, the depression would take over quite soon after that. He felt that Charlie was of the same sort of spirit, and that they both looked at life too seriously, perhaps. I don't know, but anyway, he felt a special kinship to Charlie, many years in the making. All right, enjoy the short film from the Roy Export, the Charlie Chaplin organization in Paris, which is of 1917, Max's visit to the Lone Star Studio during the shooting of The Adventurer. Thank you.